Oh my god, that was a one-shot, holy crap. Hello varlets, welcome back to another build guide. Today we're taking a look at the Mechanicus Power Sword, finally. Now, this video was supposed to be released a lot earlier, but because I really wanted to find out a perfect build that would kind of emphasize and highlight the strengths of the Mechanicus Power Sword, I ended up testing various different combinations of builds to finally arrive at this one. So what you saw at the beginning clip there, where I basically more or less one-shot a Havoc 40 Crusher, is the build that I'm sharing today. So let's dive right in. Now, as mentioned, this is going to be a Mechanicus Power Sword build, and so this will be the highlight of the build, the Mechanicus Power Sword. Now, I've already done a deep dive video on it, covering all the stats, hidden mechanics, and all the juicy stuff you need to know about the Mechanicus Power Sword. But in that video, I forgot to mention one thing, and I don't know why it eluded me, but I noticed that if you use your Empower attacks, there's actually a counter at your bottom of your HUD that appears that tells you how many stacks you're getting, right? I don't know why I missed that in my deep dive video, but here I am informing you of it. So this lets you know how many stacks you've built up, like trust. So each stack you get from there is going to be 10% melee strength for a total of 40% melee strength that you get when you finally release it at 4 stacks. So that's just an important thing to know, and will help you build up your muscle memory when it comes to maximizing the strength of the Mechanicus Power Sword. Alright, now, let's talk about the weapon itself. For the Mechanicus Power Sword's stats, I have chosen a 80% mobility rather than maxing out my power output. The reason for this is because the extra dodge that you get for having 80% mobility is much more suitable for my playstyle rather than the extra damage from your empowered attacks. Now, for those of you who don't know or haven't watched the deep dive yet, the difference between 60% power output and 80% power output is 22 damage across both light and heavy attacks. 22 doesn't sound like a lot, but that gets multiplied by the strength from your Mechanicus Power Sword, from your blessings like superiority, from your talents as well. And there were some cases in my limit control testing where I was literally short on like 100 plus damage, and having the extra damage output from here could have made a difference. But as you'll see, when it comes to the logic of putting the build together, that extra 20 damage or so, or even if it scales up, maybe isn't that big of a deal in practice in an actual game. Now, for perks, I have chosen 25% Carapace damage. This is going to be an Armor Slayer build, so we're going to want to be effective against Carapace armor, which is going to be Crushers, Maulers, the Twins, as well as Ragers. The second perk here, I have Elite Damage. And I have Elite Damage here specifically because I was doing the limit tests where I wanted to see what the upper potential was of the Mechanicus Power Sword against Crushers on Havoc 40. Realistically speaking, you can use Elite Damage and this will give you a general boost against all elites in the game, no matter what difficulty you're fighting or what faction you're hitting. But if you want to kind of min-max against specific enemies, then I would recommend either Maniac Damage or Unyielding. Maniac Damage in particular is very specific if you are fighting, say, I think Havoc 30 and above. And the reason for that is because with this current build as it is, you can very easily already kind of two-shot Rages to the head with your double tap, right? So this is your double tap, which you'll be using quite a bit to bring down Rages. But first, let me get up some stacks to get everything rolling. Now, you'll see that you can kill a Rager in 2 hits if you land it to the head without using Maniac Damage. And this deals about 2,400-ish damage if you land both hits that are non-critical. So the benefit from having a Maniac Damage perk is only going to show up once Ragers cross that threshold, which is going to be around Havoc 30. So if you want to be able to 2-tap Ragers at Havoc 30, then get Maniac for sure. The other alternative, like I mentioned earlier, is going to be Unyielding. And that's going to give you extra damage against Reapers, Bulwarks, and monsters in general. So that will also be a very useful perk to have instead of either Maniac or Elite Damage. Now, for blessings, I have chosen Superiority and Sunder. I've stated in my deep dive video that I think this is going to be the best combination of blessings because the power boost you can gain from Superiority is very sizable. Having 3 stacks of Superiority is the same as having another set of power channeling or built into your Mechanicus Power Sword, so that's a really good benefit. Sunder is probably, I would argue, for this role, for this build specifically, is a non-negotiable. The ability to cleave through armored enemies with your empowered attacks when you ordinarily otherwise couldn't is a big deal when it comes to dealing with problems. So for example, if I hit this Crusher first, I wouldn't be able to kill this one that just died because I couldn't cleave through Carapace. But with Sunderer, I can, and that makes a very big difference when it comes to improving your time to kill, especially on the higher difficulties where armor is going to be much more abundant and found in bigger groups. So that was it for our melee weapon. Now let's talk about the range weapon here. For this build, I have chosen the Phosphor Blast Pistol. I have it equipped with Flak Damage and Maniac. This is going to be a general spread of damage against the majority of enemies in the game. But specifically, you're going to use your Blast Pistol for dealing with gunners, shooters, as well as ranged specials like flamers, bombers, trappers, the usual annoying suspects. For blessings, I've gone with Opening Salvo and Crucian Roulette. This build is a crit build, which means the Blast Pistol can hit pretty hard on its own. And if you wanted to give your Blast Pistol a bit more utility, or in some indirect sense more ammo efficiency, you could take Man-Stopper instead of Crucian Roulette. I just have Crucian Roulette to use my Blast Pistol as an emergency burst damage from afar, so I can just dump my magazine at, say, a Plague Ogrin and deal a sizable amount of damage. Now, for my Curios, I have 1 toughness and 2 health. I've also picked up 10% toughness between 2 of these Curios and 5% health. This helps me reach a certain survivability breakpoint on Havoc 40. So this is not really going to be relevant all too much for Auric levels, but on Havoc 40, this means I have 100 toughness and 165 HP. And that will matter depending on how we adjust our talents later on. For the remaining perks, I've gone for 3 revive speed, 2 gunner resistance, and 1 stamina regeneration. Alright, so with all our equipment sorted out, we can now take a look at the talent section. Now, for the talents, I've already mentioned I've tried different abilities, blitzers, keystones, playing with every different combination to see what worked for the Mechanicus Power Sword best. And this one here, which is very reminiscent to my stun maxing build and anti-tank ranger build, was the one I settled on because I felt that this build really showed what the Mechanicus Power Sword could do with some modifications. Now, I won't go through the entire talent tree. You can take a look at this on screen yourself, or you can take a look at the Game Center link in the description below. But there are some key synergies, interactions that I will share here that will make not just this build, but any build that is similar to this work better, or at least give you a better understanding on what the interactions could be. And the first and probably most important one is the interaction between Voltaic Arc and System Shock. So let me remove this first. Voltaic Arc is important for this build because it affects how much brittleness you can apply to crushers. So without Voltaic Arcs, all you're dealing is 10% brittleness from the Voltaic Emitter's Shockwave. And 10% brittleness is nice, but, not exactly remarkable. The difference from having Voltaic Arcs is that you increase the number of brittleness stacks you can apply to armored enemies significantly. And it doesn't matter how many stacks you have, so you can see I have 3 stacks here. I'm just going to spend the stacks away from the crusher. And then get the stacks back to show you. Alright, so now I only have 1 stack, which means I only am firing 1 Arc Lightning, but the difference between having the Voltaic Arc and not is that the Crusher now has 30% brittleness. And from a mathematical standpoint, the difference between 10% brittleness and 30% brittleness is huge because that affects your ADM, which affects the damage you get from your blessings and your talents. And that will change how much more damage you can deal to armored enemies. So, in short, make sure you take Voltaic Arcs on any anti-armor build, because this synergizes very well with System Shock. The other interaction I'm using here is reminiscent from my stun maxing build, which I'm using with Voltaic Overcharge and Voltaic Restoration. This together gives you a minimum of 45% toughness restoration. So it's not nearly as strong as the base classes toughness regen, which most of them tend to either give you 50% or straight up fully heal you. But for this build and how aggressive we are going to want to be playing it, the ability to restore 45% toughness and more, depending on how many enemies you hit with Voltaic Overcharge, is incredibly good because it means that you can recover from mistakes in an instant. And this will save your ass in the higher difficulties like Havoc 30 onwards. Now, another interaction comes from between Voltaic Emitter as well as Last Stand Relay. If you have watched my stun maxing build guide before, this build for the Mechanicus Power Sword plays very similarly to it, where you're going to want to spam Voltaic Emitter as often as possible, especially when there's armored enemies around, to use System Shock and Voltaic Arcs to reduce their armor to make you and your team effective against them. So you're a walking anti-armor debuff that is capable of one-shotting armored enemies if they have the misfortune of coming near you. The result of using that playstyle means that Last Stand Relay is almost always going to give you that extra bonus bit of crit, that extra 4%, which on paper 4% doesn't sound very much, but if you look at it from a perk point of view, this extra 4% basically is a tier 3 perk that is kind of up most of the time because you're going to be spamming Voltaic Emitter a lot. This is also the reason why I don't have Voltaic Motivator, because you're not guaranteed to always have at least 2 charges to actually make use of this attack speed. And this build already has enough attack speed built in between Uncapped Arrestor and Servo Sinew Surge. Between these two is 27% attack speed, and I think it's more than enough already. The final interaction that I have here is to do with the integrated refraction emitter. Now, this is the first build I'm releasing that this is going to be a blitz of choice rather than the Servo Skull, which tends to be the default. And for this build specifically, I find that because of how aggressive you are going to be with this build, the IRE is incredibly helpful. And I'm so used to playing with IRE with my level of aggression that sometimes I get myself into too much trouble when I forget I'm not using this build. And the reason why this is so good is because it helps you on both the defensive and offensive front. Now, on the defensive, especially with Overcharge Refraction Emitter, activating the Blitz basically makes you immune to range enemies for 12 seconds. You turn off half the game for 12 seconds against range enemies, and that means only melee enemies can deal with you. And as you can see, melee enemies trying to hit you are going to get electrocuted periodically and also have brittleness applied to them. So what this means is that if you don't have Voltaic Emitter up, or let's say you don't want to use your Voltaic Emitter for whatever reason, you can use your IRE as a kind of pseudo Voltaic Emitter to use as a stun to build up 1 stack of System Shock, because this one doesn't release arcs. And you can also prime enemies to be electrocuted, which also gives you the damage bonus from Retribution Conduit. So let's say you have 3 stacks of Voltaic Emitter and you don't want to use it yet for whatever reason because, it's just 1 crusher. You can activate IRE to give yourself the bonus damage from applying 10% brittleness to the crusher, as well as triggering electrocution to give yourself another 25% damage from Retribution Conduit against that 1 crusher. So this is another way you can utilize your kit without solely depending on Voltaic Emitter alone. And it's for that reason why I really like Integrated Refraction Emitter. I know Servo Skull is the default and is really good. This is more DPS thanks to Nosferatu Command. It can clutch games with Medicaid Servo Skull. But if you ask me whether or not this really complements the build and really highlights the strength of the Mechanicus Power Sword, I would say that the IRE does a better job at doing that. Now, there is also going to be a flex node, which I've planted here in Force Distribution Actuators. The reason why I left it here on default is because it helps us deal with Maulers. Now, I've shown the benefit of that node time and time again against Maulers, but just for the sake of consistency and making sure that my videos remain educational for someone who's watching it for the first time, I'm also going to demonstrate it here. So what we have here is a Mauler. This Mauler is trying to kill me. Ordinarily, you can't really block its attacks, but with Force Distribution Actuators, you can. See? Behold. I can stop its overhead again and again. And no matter how many Maulers are there, as long as I have 75% stamina, I can just stun lock them in place. Without that talent, I couldn't do the same thing. So just to demonstrate, I'm going to remove it here. There you go. I can't stop the Mauler's attacks anymore. That was a guard break. So that is the main difference and probably the most useful purpose for this node. Now, if you don't want to use this, which is fine, you can absolutely do this build without this node, it's just a comfort pick. You can use this point as a flex pick. And if you're fighting Blight, you can dump it into Ablative Wards. If you want a bit more damage resistance, you can pick up Galvanized Coating. I personally wouldn't recommend taking this one because you're going to be spamming this a lot. And there are situations where if you get hit and this consumes that 5% capacitance, which prevents you from activating Voltaic Emitter, you might just end up dying because you can't heal your toughness anymore. So I would avoid taking that. You could also take Kinetic Repulsion. This is more useful in, I would say, Havoc 40, more so than the lower difficulties. And the possibility of using this particular node here is the reason why I've chosen my Curios to be as such. So, because... Oh, let me go back to the talent. Because this reduces the amount of damage you can take from a single hit to 50, that means a Crusher's overhead will not pancake you immediately from full health. And with 165 health, what you can do is tank up to 3 pancakes and then still have 15 HP left over. And that is just enough health with the Curio setup that we got to make this actually useful. So yeah, this is where your flex node can also go to if you don't want to use Force Distribution Actuators. Now, Last but not least, I'm going to give you a couple of mechanics or like, tech that you can use with this build, or rather the Mechanicus Power Sword in general. Let me just pull out something that's a bit tankier to use as a punching bag. So, as I showed in the beginning of the video, one of the combos you can do to execute a melee enemy quite quickly is to use your Voltaic emitter, push attack into your heavy 3. This almost always one-shots a melee enemy because the amount of damage boost you gain from applying the brittleness onto the Crusher and activating all your buffs will give you a lot of damage, which is why on Auric, that is almost a guaranteed one-shot no matter what. If you have no charges for your Voltaic emitter, then your regular combo against Crushers is going to be a heavy, light, into a charge overhead strike. That is normally enough damage to deal with an Auric level Crusher from base. That was a crit. Let's see if we can get one without a crit. Yeah, so it's very close to killing it. And as long as you have one stack of brittleness, the Crusher will die. Or you've crit at least once, the Crusher will die from that combo. Yeah, it's close. I think once you've stacked up enough superiority stacks, you will deal enough damage to actually one-shot it with a full combo quite consistently as well. Now, another useful thing, which I use quite often, is improving your mobility with the Mechanicus Power Sword's charge attack. Ordinarily, if you're trying to charge and move, you're kind of stuck, right? You're stuck in this slow-ass moving animation, which is kind of problematic. The way around this, I have found, is to use your sprint into a slide. So you can still cover quite a amount of distance from sprinting immediately when you're charging your attack, and then slide forwards. So for example, if I stand here, I charge up, I can travel some distance. It's not much, right? From here, it's like what, 5 meters? 5 meters is a decent amount of distance to travel with a slide, and your Mechanicus Power Sword does have some reach. So if this is, say, 7 meters, can we reach? We can reach 7 meters. So using a slide, using a sprint into a slide will give you about a 7 meter reach with your Mechanicus Power Sword's charge attack. Can I do it further with the stab? No, 9 meters is too far. What about 8 meters? 8 meters with the stab. So that's a bit of a stretch, but it can be done. So yeah, that's everything you needed to know about this build. This has been very fun to put together actually, and this build has shaped up to be one of my more frequently used builds when it comes to playing the Skitarii. I think the Mechanicus Power Sword was initially very clunky, but after spending so much time with it, it's kind of become second nature to me, almost like using the Relic Blade in some sense. I hope you found this video useful. Let me know in the comments what you think about this build and how you are enjoying your Mechanicus Power Sword. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you in the next one, varlets.